welcome once again to this seminar today. Our esteemed speaker for today is Professor Ajay Shah. He is Research Professor of Business with Jindal Global Business School. He studied at IIT Bombay and USC Los Angeles. He is also a research fellow at George Mason University. Professor Shah has held positions at Center for Monitoring Indian Economy, Indira Gandhi Institute for Development Research, Department of Economics Affairs at the Ministry of Finance, and National Institute for Public Finance and Policy. He does academic and policy-oriented research on India at the intersection of economics, law, and public administration. Professor Shah's second book, co-authored with Vijay Kelkar, is In Service of the Public, The Art and Science of Economic Policy, and it was published in 2019 by Penguin Allen Lane. His areas of focus are macroeconomics, finance, health, and technology policy. Thank you very much, Professor Shah, for being here today. We are very delighted to welcome you and have you with us.
Thank you very much. It's a delight to be here.
Although virtually, one day we hope we will be able to invite you in person to Ahmedabad University. In conversation with Professor Shah today, we have Professor Ravi Miglani. He is our Professor of Practice of Management with Ahmedabad University. He is also the Director of the GEMBA Programme. Professor Miglani has keen interest in marketing research, consumer behavior, consumer insights, neuromarketing, behavioral economics, and ethnography. He has 35 years of experience in the field of marketing research and has worked in many parts of the world on this area. At Ahmedabad University, he is creating very interesting courses and programs in the area of marketing research and other interdisciplinary related areas. Without taking much time, I hand over the platform today to Professor Miglani to please begin the conversation with Professor Shah. Thank you.
Thank you, Bijal. Thanks a lot for the introductions and some very interesting outcomes from the polls, which I'm sure Ajay will pick up during the conversation and comment on. And welcome again, Ajay, to this conversation. So we're talking about public policy, and those of you, which I believe is all of you who know Ajay Shah's work, would know that Ajay can talk about public policy for hours or days at end. His writings in this area are so deep and so scholarly that it's not up to me to ask many questions. So I'll stay in the background and let you listen to the wisdom coming from Ajay. But to just kick it off for us, to understand any subject, Ajay, as it's best to understand where we are today and where we are going in this whole area of public policy and government intervention. It is best to understand how we got here. What is the history? What brought us to this point in our public policy domain? So maybe to start us off, could you give us like a cliff notes of the history of public policy in India?
Sure. We started out on this story about 100 years ago, where the Indian intelligentsia, which at that time was entirely the INC, it was Gandhiji and Nehru and Patel and a whole bunch of people that worked with them, started thinking and dreaming about what it would mean to be a free country and what is the nature of a free India. And there were great debates around those questions. People like Baba Ambedkar had views about these things, as did Gandhiji and so on. So there was a great debate around those questions. And it's very interesting and important to note the long time frames involved. So roughly speaking, from about 1920, Indian intellectuals started thinking, what would it mean to be free? What would a free India look like? And in 1947, they got their big chance to actually do something with those ideas. So please note that this was a long period of 27 years in the wilderness, being opposed to the most powerful empire in the world. Okay, you've got to respect the people that had the staying power to do this kind of thought process. And these ideas translated into the Constitution of India and into the strategy of what Nehru and Mahalanobis built as the Indian state and as the strategy for Indian economic policy after 1947. And if I may succinctly characterize that approach, it was this idea that there needs to be a developmental state, that the state has to exert a big leadership role in envisioning the contours of what India would be. And the state will use its power in all kinds of ways in pushing that transformation forward. Okay. And in his deepest intuition, Nehru had this concept that in about 50 years, we will match the glory and the greatness of the UK. Okay, so on one hand, it was very clear that liberal democracy in the UK is the aspiration, is the dream, that we wanted to be a UK quality civilization, and we wanted to do it quickly. We're not going to take hundreds of years. Okay, so in about 2 generations, we can get the job done. We can eliminate mass poverty in India. And it's hard to not be amazed at that, the audacity of that conception. Okay, we should never forget that in 1947, female literacy in India was 6%. Okay, that's all. Female literacy in India in 1947 was 6%. And starting from there, the Congress elite had this breathtaking dream that we will do a liberal democracy, we will do universal suffrage, we will build a developmental state, and there will be state leadership, there will be state domination, and we will rapidly become a beautiful, good country. There will be prosperity, there will be freedom. Okay, and it worked for some time. The growth in the period immediately after independence was the highest ever in India's history. It was better than anything that was obtained under British rule. And then things basically fell apart. We had a China war in 62, in 64, Nehru died. And then in Indira Gandhi's period, we got a worsening of Indian socialism, of control by the government. We got a whole bunch of repressive laws, and it all collapsed into the emergency. So really ran the vehicle into the ground in the period from 1962 to 1977. And by the way, many good scholars at the time thought that this is curtains, that the Indian experiment has failed, that the precocious Indian attempt at trying to be a genuine liberal democracy at an early stage in terms of socio-economic foundations of the country was infeasible and broke. That, you could not get a better leadership than Gandhiji and Nehru and Ambedkar and Patel. And yet this thing was run into the ground. So basically this is impossible. At that level of poverty and deprivation, at that level of illiteracy and ignorance, it can't be done. Okay, and then you got a dramatic restart of this process in 1977, when Morarji Desai became the prime minister and H.M. Patel became the finance minister and D.T. Lakdawala became the deputy chairman of the planning commission. And by that time, the Indian elite had started thinking about these questions. So some of the great intellectuals of the age had thought deeply about what went wrong in the preceding period. So people like Jagdish Bhagwati, Arun Shuri, T.N. Srinivasan, Manmohan Singh, Ashok Desai, all these people had written trenchant critiques of the Nehru Indira Gandhi period and of the arrogance of thinking that the state can play a leadership role in a vast complex economy, and of the very genuine damage that is done when power is concentrated in the state. So there was a new beginning in terms of questioning these things. It also helps greatly that by that time, a bunch of East Asian countries had actually run ahead of India. Now that was deeply bruising for the morale of the Indian elite. Okay, see, in 1947, India was the hero. In 1947, there was no country like India in the previously colonized or developing world. India was the land of Rabindranath Tagore and C.V. Raman and Ramanujan. Okay? So India was like within kissing distance of greatness and glory. We had a proud elite that was absolutely world class. We were the ones that were supposed to do something better. And it was absolutely humbling that By 1977, it was becoming clear that South Korea and Taiwan and Hong Kong and even places like Malaysia and Singapore were starting to run ahead of India, and that there was something seriously wrong about what we were doing. So some of our confidence and our pride was shaken because we had understood how badly India was doing, and that there were other countries that had actually done much better than India. So from 1977, we started getting a change of course in India. In the mainstream stories that are told about India, there's a lot of accent on 1991 July as a big decisive reform. My opinion is that I disagree. I think that there was a process of change. It began in 1977. It was mercifully carried forward by Indira Gandhi in 1980. It was carried forward by Rajiv Gandhi when he became Prime Minister. And it led up to the July 1991 reforms where Manmohan Singh, Ashok Desai, and then Monte Ahluwalia played a big role. And all this added up to the greatest single episode of growth in India ever, which is 1991 to 2011. Okay, that's the 20 years of greatness and glory. That was when it suddenly looked that we in India have got our act together and we are able to produce decent GDP growth. If we could keep running for 40 more years at that rate, we're done. We're a developed country, and most of the problems of the country are solved. I also want to emphasize that when you see a vast growth acceleration like 1991 to 2011, it is almost always the case that such complex phenomena are multi-causal. So almost by construction, if you tell me that, look, there was a Manmohan Singh speech in July 1991, and then suddenly growth went up. That's not the way the world works. Many, many things have to come together. So you really have to look at the story of the preceding 10, 15 years, and many pieces fall into place. And then you get a great growth acceleration. Okay, and so it worked for some time, and it was nothing less than spectacular. We got 350 million people who were removed from a state of poverty in that period, and that is the only big episode of poverty elimination in India. So as Kelkar and I say in the book, 1991 to 2011 worked for the rich, where we started creating unbelievable wealth for the rich on a global scale. We started getting rich people in India who were big by world standards. It was no longer just some dinky, irrelevant country. We started getting rich people who were impressive by world standards. It was great for the middle class, where, for people like me and my family, for the first time, we got to the point where we were able to afford, appliances and televisions and refrigerators and plane travel and so on. And so there was a transformative event in the life of the middle class. And it was transformative for a lot of poor people who basically escaped the poverty line. So whether you thought about the rich or the middle class or the poor, 1991 to 2011 was simply miraculous. It was the greatest achievement of economic policy in India's history. And then it stopped working. Depending on how you want to count, private investment in India peaked in 2007 or it peaked in 2011. So something went wrong. Private investment peaked in 2007 and has done worse ever since, or it peaked in 2011 and it has declined ever since, depending on how you measure it. And I just want to reiterate that all the good things, all the prosperity, all the jobs of the country only come out of private investment. The government is impossibly irrelevant to the basic engine of prosperity and jobs in the country. For example, all the civil servants in India put together, some 30, 40 million. Okay, that's all. It's just an insignificant part of the overall country. So engines of growth are in the private sector. And when private investment falters, you will have difficulties in prosperity, in jobs, in every measurable metric. The heart and soul of progress in India is to create conditions for private investment. In the book, Kelkar and I call this first idea of Indian economic growth what was done by Nehru and Mahalanobis. We call it Mark 1. It's the first theory of a developmental state led by the government. We call the work of Arun Shourie and Manmohan Singh and Jagdish Bhagwati and T.N. Srinivasan and Monte Ahluwalia and Kelkar and that entire community, their shining achievement, the 91 to 2011 period. We call that Mark 2. where there were certain things that were done and there were big gaping gaps in what was done. And we challenge ourselves that the great question of the age today is, what's Mark 3 going to be? Okay, so we have faltered, we have lost ground, we've lost momentum, we've almost forgotten what it is to be a dynamic, fast-growing country that earns the respect and the envy of the whole world. That's not where India is today. We've had a really humbling period where many things just don't look good in India. So the great intellectual question of the age is, what went wrong? What is the theory of the state and the republic and the economy through which we can pick up the pieces and reconstruct an idea of India where we get these things together again, and we create conditions for sustained growth for 40 years, where we are able to reimagine what is the meaning of being a liberal democracy, what is the meaning of being a mature market economy, how can we make private people feel safe and confident again, how can we get back to the dynamism and the energy of the private sector that was seen in 1991 to 2011. And once again, just like I said, there is no one simple explanation about why growth accelerated in 1991. Like that, there's no simple one causal explanation of why growth faltered in 2011. Many things went wrong. Many things went wrong. We need to rethink the entire edifice and figure out what is going on. And just to put it in a nutshell, what Kelkar and I are thinking and what we have argued in the book is a square with 4 corners. We think about freedom. We think that the most important motive force in human society is the energy and the dynamism and the ambition of free people. It's a story of political freedom and economic freedom. We think about market failure. Market failure is a technical economics term. It's a class of situations where the unbounded actions of free people lead to certain deficiencies. And that creates conditions under which there is a case for government intervention. And so that's the theory of why do you need a state and where do you need a state. If there's no market failure, you don't need a state. And the Indian state is all over the Indian landscape, intervening and restraining human freedom in ways that are entirely inappropriate. And then the moment you start thinking about state intervention, we come to the crisis of state failure, of the limitations of state capacity, of the difficulties of being a state in India, of honestly coming to grips with the enormous failures of the Indian state, and then asking first principles questions. Why does the state fail and what can we do differently? So that's this book. This book is organized around these 4 corners: on understanding freedom, on understanding market failure, on understanding the theory of state intervention, and on understanding the all-pervasive failure of the Indian state. So that's my rough big picture of a historical journey of 100 years of the story of India. So, long years ago, we made a tryst with destiny. We need a new theoretical framework to redeem our pledge.
That was such a roller coaster ride. In 10 minutes, you've taken us through the lows of the 60s and 70s and the highs of 77 to 2011. And then you brought us down with a crash. So so that was, you should look at a side gig of being a Cliff Notes writer. That was a very good summary of 100 years. So again, just for layman among us, including me, from the outside, what we believe is government intervenes when there is market failure, as you guys call it, or when there are negative externalities where private sector action is leading to harming some other segments of the society. And then the government does need to intervene. So what is wrong with that? Shouldn't government intervene when there's a market failure or when there's a negative externality?
Yeah, the modern public economics reasoning is that government is potentially useful when there is market failure and some caveats to follow. But the very deep idea is government is not needed when there is no market failure. Okay, so the landscape of the Indian state is littered with all kinds of activities by the government, but there is no market failure. So that's the deep idea, that take market failure seriously. Before you say, I want a government to do X, ask a basic question: is there a market failure? Why do we need a government? So that's, the flaw of the Nehru Mahalanobis state domination, where the government became a central planner, the government became a super CEO of the country, of the economy, where the government walked around the country and said, why don't we do this? Why don't we do this? Why don't we do this? And I think modern thinking has pulled back a lot more to say we're better off by thinking of a narrow class of market failures. The standard economics checklist is: there is market failure when there are monopolies, there is market failure when there are negative externalities or positive externalities, there is market failure when there are public goods, where there are things like clean air or like personal safety, where no one person can readily do these things, but they're much easier done by using the state and they benefit everybody. And the fourth is when there are some real crises of asymmetric information, where normal consumer choice breaks down, where as a customer going into a restaurant, it's not reasonably feasible for me to go into the kitchen and verify that the kitchen is clean. Okay, so these are the four categories where there can be market failure and there is a case for state intervention. But the really powerful import of these concepts is actually it gives us a theoretical lens to look at the Indian state. And we see a vast number of activities of the Indian state that don't fit these four bins. And it'll be good if many of us will start asking basic questions: that do you really require an Indian government that does this? Do you really require an Indian government that uses its supreme power, its monopoly of violence, to instruct people to do this and not instruct people to do this? And that actually freedom would be a better approach.
Yeah, which, to paraphrase you, which you have said in your book and in many other places, I'm paraphrasing that government intervention, even in cases where it's needed, needs to be light touch and precision, rather than heavy-handed and general. You have a very interesting paraphrasing of Rahim there, saying, why use a sword when a needle will do? So that is the kind of precise, targeted intervention rather than taking over a whole industry. Is that what you mean? Yeah.
When there is a vague unease, that's not enough to create government intervention. And very often there is an unintellectual discourse where you give the dog a bad name and hang him. So you get things in India like we're going to ban cryptocurrency. Like, other than China, we're the only country in the world that wants to ban cryptocurrency. Whereas actually you need to analyze it in a more detailed way and think, look, if there are human beings that want to do it, they should be free to do it. And maybe there is a market failure, and maybe there is a role for a state, or maybe there is no role for a state. But vague unease does not suffice. And precise articulation and demonstration of the market failure guides us to more precise interventions, which will solve the problem rather than have all kinds of large-scale unintended effects.
Yeah, and when you talk of government intervention, even when it is justified due to market failure or externalities, you broadly classify government intervention as either government gets into production or regulation or financing. Is there a thumb rule on that government should not get into production? We've had over the last 70 years cases where government has been making wristwatches and scooters and washing machines. Should the government get into production or stick to regulation and financing?
So see, with wristwatches, it's a very easy thing because there's no market failure. The market for wristwatches works perfectly. You have Timex competing with Seiko, competing with Casio, whatever. I have an absolutely amazing Casio watch that costs 700 rupees. And that is done by the perfect enterprise of the capitalist economy. The companies compete with each other and they make great watches. So there's no market failure in the world of watches. And so right there, you get the idea that the government is not needed in the watch business. There is no market failure. Just get out, let free markets do it. When you do get to market failure, we have these three bins that a government can either produce something itself, or it can regulate, private people doing it, or it can finance the purchase of things by private people. Uh, there are many inappropriate choices in India, so it helps to think for a moment about what we might like to do. When there's a positive externality, such as Ahmedabad University, okay, so Ahmedabad University is building high quality graduates, and those graduates have positive externalities upon society. The knowledge, the ethos, the professional excellence, and the moral values of the students exert positive spillovers upon society. So the gains to society exceed the gains for any one student. And the solution there is government funding. So you don't need the government to run universities, you need the government to fund universities. And all over the world, there is the machinery of either education vouchers, which is more at the schooling level, or research contracts, research grants. And basically, governments fund research at universities, and universities co-produce educational services, and that helps to pay for some of that positive externality. The second pathway is regulation. So you may say that cars are unsafe at any speed, but then the solution lies not in a government monopoly that makes cars, but government regulation of the safety characteristics of cars. Okay, so as an example, in India, we have a government monopoly on the Indian railways. Okay? It's probably not a very efficient pathway. Okay, for a contrast, government may own the highways, but private people run trucks on the highways. You just need to have sufficiently good brakes, and you need enforcement mechanisms by which people will stop at the red light. But for the rest, we could readily envision hundreds of competing private trains running on railway lines that are potentially owned by the government, or maybe railway lines that are also private. There could be tolling. So do you need a government as an owner? Okay, probably not. So government regulation can generate conditions of safety. And so government ownership is a more troubled environment, where oftentimes you can get things done more effectively through the private sector by regulation or financing. Now, my views on this have been shifting because it has become increasingly clear in the last 20 years that government regulation is actually pretty intricate and pretty complicated. It is very difficult for government to do regulation. So, having a private water utility and having a government regulator is harder than meets the eye. Having a private electricity utility and having a government regulator is harder than meets the eye. So in India, we are in a precarious zone where, it sucks to have a government water utility and it sucks to have a government regulator. And, we are in that zone of choosing between two poor choices. But in an ideal world, we would learn to build regulatory capacity, and then it would become clearly superior that there should be a private water utility and there should be government regulation.
Excellent. Just as a disclaimer, your plug for Ahmedabad University's positive externalities was completely from your heart. We did not request that.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. But yes, I get the point that how educational institutions bring positive externalities to the research ecosystem in their neighborhood, like most famously like Stanford in Silicon Valley and so on. So the other point is, even if all of these things are done right and the government intervention is precise and targeted and not a broad brush takeover of a whole sector, there seems to be in India, again, a tendency for these interventions to not go deep into the root cause and then just paint over the symptoms. You have very interesting examples in your talks and books about how when there's high level of road accidents on India's highway, the solution is not to build more hospitals near the highways. The solution is to fix the highways so that accidents don't happen, rather than let accidents happen and then have a healthcare system to fix the broken people. So what stops the government going to the root cause and fixing that rather than the symptom?
So one part is it's just about intellectual capacity. I think the public discourse in India is very weak. We don't analyze problems deeply. So if we read the material in almost any field, it's not very well done. So I think we in the intellectual community need to up our game. We need to significantly improve our literature. The second problem is the disciplinary boundaries. So health is a great example that almost all the determinants of health lie outside a Ministry of Health, lie outside the expertise of doctors, and lie outside the traditional work of the health discipline, which tends to focus on healthcare. But actually, the determinants of health lie in air quality, which is most likely about the burning of fields in Punjab. The determinants of health lie in road safety, which lie in the field of infrastructure. The determinants of health lie in the food system, where modern industrialized food is killing all of us, okay, and so on. So if you take interest in health, in no time, you've got to go jump over the boundaries across the disciplines and start taking interest in all those other things. But the very barriers that define our disciplines, so the department in a university becomes our blinkers. The Ministry of Health becomes our blinkers. Doctors have an orientation towards fixing up broken bodies rather than discussing why they got broken in the first place. So the role of doctors in the Indian health policy discourse tends to create a bias in favor of healthcare, whereas actually the most exciting opportunities in health policy lie in prevention. That, can we be more healthy so that you never have to go to a doctor in the first place.
Good. And the other place where even the most well-researched, if there is such a thing, but most well-researched policy interventions tend to backfire is because what I sometimes call putting the public back in the public policy. There is no public discourse, there's no discussion, there's no debate, there's no transparency to discuss the policy before it is suddenly out of nowhere thrust on people, and that leads to unnecessary resistance, which could have been sorted out during the debate phase, like we very famously saw in the farm bills, which we might get to later. So why is there such a rush to just announce without doing a debate? Mm-hmm.
So there is a mistaken idea in India that we need to solve things quickly. So because that sounds so strange, I want to qualify myself that actually making important progress on any piece of public policy is a very long-term thing. So in the book, we have an example about cleaning the Rhine River, which spans 6 countries in Europe. That river had been completely destroyed through chemical pollution. And the countries got together. So it was harder than India because it was the collaboration between many countries. The countries got together and set in motion a process of cleaning the river. And the project took 35 years. Okay, so to make a meaningful difference to the cleanliness of the Ganga is a 35-year project. And if we think that you can do it in 35 months, then that creates tremendous pressure for rapid action. And also, if we are more keen on showcasing the policy actions rather than the results, then that tends to be a bit counterproductive. So I feel what works better is to marinate a public debate, for there to be many rival viewpoints, to have an honest, difficult public discussion and debate around issues. And then what works well in India is a government committee process. The job of government committees is to sift through rival views and choose a couple of ideas that seem to make more sense. And then these funnel up into a government decision process. And then you get to the drafting of laws and building state capacity for implementation. And this takes time. So in Hindi, there's a phrase, there's a jaldbazi that has come to afflict India, that we want to get seized with a problem on Friday and write a 3-page note over the weekend and announce a policy action on Monday. And it's fashionable to do that. The political system and the officials, to some extent, are responding to the behavior of the modern discourse and the modern electronic media, but it doesn't work well. It doesn't get things done.
Yeah, because which is understandable from their point of view. The lifespan, you would know more exactly, but the lifespan of a typical secretary in a ministry or the minister himself or herself is a couple of years or 3 years or 4 years. So they want to pick some low-hanging fruit quickly and show that they have done something, so it shows on their CV. So they have pressures on them to quickly show results, rather than say this will show results in 35 years, which they'll be long gone by that time, so it won't reflect on their profile. So what this is coming to, that there's not enough research and data analysis in the beginning. There's not enough uh, precision. There's not enough public debate. So this whole process, you term it, and you and Kelkar term it as the policy pipeline. Could you please give us a short introduction to what is a ideal policy pipeline, which very often doesn't happen?
In every field, uh, we in India and anywhere in the world walk in the steps of a policy pipeline. It starts by data gathering. That for a field to ever be figured out, it needs information systems. And these are not just one-off data gathering episodes, but long-term sustained data gathering. Then you come to stage 2, which is the research, where we are studying the data and figuring out facts about the world. We're making descriptive papers, we're making causal claims, and we are understanding the world. Then we come to a creative phase of inventing policy proposals, where we're trying to say, that if we do X, maybe it's going to work well. And many people need to apply themselves to offer creative policy proposals. And then that comes a public debate where rival depictions of how this should be played would compete with each other in a public argument about what should be done, where there is view 1 and view 2 and view 16, and they fight with each other in articles and in seminars and in conferences. And that debate and disagreement is absolutely essential. And at its best, the protagonists are good human beings, and they're able to talk with each other and learn from each other. When I say fight, I don't mean the modern dog fights and cat fights that happen on the internet, but I mean a more civilized form of discourse. Then you come to the government decision process, which starts at high quality committee reports, which effectively sift through this literature and this public debate and back a few ideas. And then the internal decisions within government that, okay, let's go do X. And then finally, you come to the policy implementation, which is about writing laws and building government organizations that will enforce laws. So that's the design of organizations, the organization structure of government organizations problem. So this is the policy pipeline. It is a useful way to think about any field, that if you think agriculture is important, then this is the first set of questions: that do we have the requisite data? What are the gaps in the data? Do we have the research? What are the gaps in the research? What's the state of the public discourse? Are people inventing creative, novel policy proposals? Is there a good debate? Are we able to sift through this debate and come up with ideas? Do we have 10 experts in the country who can become members of government committees? Okay. Have we got the 1, 2, 3, 4 main government committee reports that have sifted through this discourse and come up with reasonable middle ground consensus positions? And then the time is ripe for some politician to wake up and say, X is a big problem, we need to solve it. And then we've got the foundation that, yeah, there are many papers, there are many experts. We've got these 6 different government committee reports. This is roughly where we stand. This is what needs to be done. And then somebody makes those decisions that we're going to do X. And then you need the internal horsepower in government, because it's one thing to decide that we're going to do X, that here I've got a 300-page government committee report. It has figured out this. Now let's go do it. But then it's a very different thing to actually have the horsepower on implementation, of drafting good quality laws, and of building government organizations, of doing the organization design for state capacity. So this is the pipeline. And you can literally diagnose success or failure in one field or another in India by looking at the state of maturity in the pipeline. And unfortunately, the pipeline flows from left to right. If you have not done the early stages, you will flounder and fail in the late stages.
So this is very, I mean, no one can disagree with this. This is like one of those which we can say a motherhood statement. Obviously, this should be followed, and you and Kelkar have put it in a structured format, but intuitively, I presume most civil servants and senior level secretaries in government would know that intellectually. I presume your book is required reading for the bureaucrats. So they must have read your book. And you have been on the other side in government, and Vijay Kelkar has been far more on the other side as well. So they know you, you know them. So why don't they do it? It's coming from good authority like you and Kelkar and others.
So
Why is it not done?
I mean, I'm very happy that you find it self-evident and obvious, but I think that a lot of people don't think like this. And whether it is an official or a politician or even a philanthropist, this long journeys are daunting. So the incentives are always that I don't want to solve early stages of the pipeline because they're going to yield results deep in the future. Can't we get to doing something right now? So there's just this terrifying focus on the price and saying, we've not diagnosed the problem, but let's go take some action.
Yeah, I mean, that action bias is all over the place. I have spent a few decades in the corporate world, and that action bias, a CEO before the next shareholder meeting needs to show some.
So there are lots of derogatory phrases. There is paralysis through analysis. There is bias for action, and I'm all for action, but you need to know what's going on. And because using state power, because using state violence is morally fraught with difficulties, I think there should be a particularly high bar there. So if I was the owner of a company and I bumbled and made mistakes with my own money, that's okay. But by the time I'm spending the money of shareholders who are not me, I think the bar needs to be higher. And when you have violence in the picture, which is the activities of the state, then the bar should be very, very high. That no, I do not like to have a bias for action. Until you figured it out, please do nothing. So freedom should be the natural state. By default, human beings should be free. There should be a very high bar of knowledge and analysis before state actors interfere in the freedom of the people.
So what is again, I'm not at all familiar with the government and public policy worlds, but in the corporate world, there is, though often flouted, but there is a concept of corporate governance. There is a concept of fiduciary responsibility. There is independent members of the board who will not let the CEO run away and do such random actions.
Yes.
Is there an equivalent in the government?
So in the corporate sector, as you will know well, over and over, what happens is that power gets centralized into a CEO. And these governance things don't work. So over and over, what we find is that power should be dispersed, but power becomes concentrated. Over and over, you get the managers inside an organization who are really adrift without governance. The principal is the shareholder, but the principal is not present, and the CEO or the CEO and the management team call all the shots and exert disproportionate power. Well, so it is with government. That the essential concepts of liberal democracy are that the people are the principal, and the people have to authorize all forms of state violence. But that seldom happens. And all too often, what we are getting in India increasingly is called the administrative state. The administrative state is where executive and legislative and judicial powers go to officials, and those officials are like dictators. They run the place. They have godlike powers over private people, and there's no check and balance. So I cannot think of a single government organization where the board works well.
Okay, I think since we are getting close to 5, in being in a management institute, we love to do case studies. We believe that through case studies, we can understand concepts better rather than just through theory. So theoretically, we are all very clear on what you have laid out in terms of the limits of government intervention, when market failure qualifies for an intervention, what is the pipeline that needs to be followed. So all that theoretically looks good. Let's, in the next few minutes, spend some time on the case, which is live in front of us right now, which is the procurement and distribution and rollout of COVID-19 vaccines. Is that going well as per your pipeline?
We are at rank 70 in the world in terms of the proportion of the population that has got the vaccine. So no, it's not going well.
So which steps of the pipeline have got messed up, or which step of, was there a market failure? Was government right to centrally control it, and even more centrally control it after the announcement of the Prime Minister a few days ago that it will now be entirely procured by the center and states will not procure? So was any shortcuts there in the pipeline?
Yeah. So it's good to go to the foundations, to the market failure thinking. What is the market failure in a vaccine? When I buy a vaccine, I get better because now my probability of disease has gone down. But on top of that, I impose a positive externality upon you because now I'm not likely to spread the disease to you. Okay. So that's the heart of it. It's exactly like what I was saying about higher education, about Ahmedabad University, that the recipient of education at Ahmedabad University benefits because she directly achieves some knowledge, but she imposes positive externalities upon the society. She imposes positive externalities upon her family, upon her workplace, and so on. Okay, so it's exactly that it's a private good with a positive externality. So there is a standard toolkit. What do you do when there are private goods with externalities? The standard toolkit is government financing. So what is the logic? That if there is a price tag of 2,000 rupees for getting vaccinated, case one, I feel it's worth more than 2,000 rupees for me and I get vaccinated. Great, please go for it. We're done. Okay. Even though there was a market failure, that I do not price the benefits for you, but if the benefits to me are adequate, great, I do it. I'm done. There's no market failure. So in the class of people who are willing to put down their 2,000 rupees and get vaccinated, there is no market failure. Just let it go. And the more people that do it, the better. Okay. We should all bless our neighbors and friends and family who take the trouble of getting vaccinated, who pay for the vaccine, because then we benefit, because then the chances of the disease coming to me go down when the people around me get vaccinated. Okay. And that leaves a class of people who may say, I don't want to pay 2,000 rupees to get vaccinated. Okay. I want to note in passing that for 70% of India, the decline in income in the 1 year after the pandemic has been greater than rupees 10,000 rupees. So for 70% of India, 2,000 rupees per person is not a scary number. Okay? But leave it be. There is a class of people who are going to say, no, for me, it's not worth it. I don't feel like paying 2,000 rupees for me to get vaccinated. In order to overcome the positive externality, potentially there is a case for some government funding. Exactly like in the case of Ahmedabad University, exactly like in the case of education. You could have vaccine vouchers where the government will part fund the vaccine. Okay, so this is a simple first principles reasoning involving market failure. Now, in countries like Israel and the US and the UK, there was a giant government-led system that very quickly and efficiently did vaccination for the whole country. I admire those countries. What they have achieved is fabulous. When these debates started out in India in August or September, what I was saying was that this is not possible in India. We need to recognize the frailty of the Indian state. The Indian state has limitations. Okay, so as an example, today in India, we try to roll out 25 million mothers and 25 million infants. We try to roll out vaccinations for them. So we're doing 50 million people per year. And these programs get to 60-70% coverage. So faced with a small problem of 50 million people, where we've been building an institutional infrastructure for 70 years, we achieve coverage of 60-70%. So asking the Sarkari system to do 1 billion people is just not going to work. It's not feasible. Never in the history of public administration has such a large leap taken place. So while we admire a large government-led thing that was done in Israel or the US or the UK, it's not on offer here in India because that kind of state capability doesn't exist. So we need to think in different ways. And what is the most important element of that different way? The most important element of that different way is the Indian state should not interfere in what other people are doing. The most important thing to watch is the use of state violence. Okay, so at various stages in the Indian vaccination story, the Indian state said, I will prohibit you on threat of state violence from importing vaccines. And you could be a private person, you could be a subnational government, and you are prohibited from importing vaccines. The Indian state said, I prohibit you from doing vaccination. Even today, you are a medical provider, I am an individual citizen, and the Indian state says, if you don't go through my COVIN, then we will impose sanctions upon the healthcare provider. This is a whole new level of intrusion of the state into the private affairs of the people. That why is the state interfering like this? So I do not have optimism that the Indian state has the ability to organize 1 billion vaccinations. It would be nice if we lived in such a country. We don't. But the Indian state could help make things better by not coming in the way. So don't interfere with imports. Don't interfere with private people doing vaccination. Don't interfere with states and city governments doing vaccination. Don't interfere with the conversation between an individual and a healthcare provider. On top of that, if the union government will organize more vaccination, we're all for it. So try to help, but don't hinder. So there should be a Hippocratic oath that don't reduce the amount of vaccination that is being done in the country through energy of the private sector. And I have no fixed conception of that energy. It depends. Some people will put resources. There can be all kinds of innovations about resources. It can be at the level of a housing complex. It can be at the level of Ahmedabad University. Maybe Ahmedabad University will decide that we're sick and tired of operating on these silly video calls. And we will put down money. We will import vaccines from Pfizer. And we'll just do this for our entire faculty and students. And we finish with our nightmare and we get back to operation. Maybe that's optimal for Ahmedabad University. Who is the government to interfere in these choices? So my worldview is that we should focus on state violence, always try to diminish state violence. The state interference that was done in vaccination does not flow from our understanding of the market failure. The role for the state, if any, was to do more, to maybe give more money to people to get themselves vaccinated, or to run camps, to stand on the roadside and vaccinate more people. Instead, the state put itself into a coercive role that we will prevent this, we will prevent this, we will prevent this, we will force you to use COVIN, we will force you to supply data into COVIN. At first, we were told COVIN is for data gathering. Now COVIN is being used for coercion. That I am prevented from getting my second dose because 84 days have not gone by after my first dose. And it is increasingly clear that the number 84 is not actually correct. So, people are going to die because of these decisions. I think a Hippocratic oath in public policy should be, if a state can help, it's nice, but a state should not hinder.
Okay, yeah, that's a very drastic view. My guess is, again, and as an outsider, is there's something in the Indian psyche which treats vaccines as very sacred. And we have memories, I think the government and policymakers have memories of the glory days where India did a great job in smallpox vaccination and polio vaccination and so on. So the state believes that we have done it. We have done it. We've eradicated smallpox. We've eradicated polio. So we can do it again. And it is counterintuitive, even I don't know whether to the state, but to even outsiders, because of this framework in which we have grown up, to think of vaccine as a private good, as you calling it, because we think intuitively as vaccine being a public good, because we have always through our lifetime seen vaccines being run by
that
government.
is the power of the intellectual toolkit of modern public economics. And that is the kind of hard-headed reasoning that is the Mark III that we require. We need to think from scratch, be analytically precise, and we cannot get shining insight and intuition and clarity into many questions. And that is the machinery that we need to get India to becoming a prosperous, successful country.
Yeah, the only thing there, which I don't know whether there's a solution to that, but the moment if this happens, this world that you are describing, that vaccination is open to the private sector. If a company wants to import vaccines to vaccinate its employees, it's free to do that. If someone wants to charge 2,000 rupees for a vaccine, they do that. While the government tops up for those who cannot afford the 2,000, is all well and good. But there's this whole, and it's already there on Twitter threads and so on. There's this whole thing of, oh, this vaccination is all for rich people, and this whole rich poor, and the government doesn't care about. The moment it becomes private, private is equated with good for rich people. So that discourse will start. How do you counter that?
Yeah, so there is a mass media problem and there is an elite media problem. My concern is that some of this knowledge is absent in the most rarefied intellectual elite of India. So we have a long way to go. The basic knowledge and concepts are weak. And that's why these kinds of episodes are so interesting and so important, because we just have to work through the hard-headed deductive logic that when a rich person pays $20,000 to get vaccinated, that person is doing me a favor, because now the chances of disease transmission from that person to me go down. So, we should be grateful to everybody that puts down money to get vaccinated, rather than getting into the politics of envy that that person got vaccinated and I did not. There is a problem in our health discourse. Okay, so for example, you talked about smallpox. In my paper on vaccination, I actually analyzed that story at length. And I just want to say one thing, that India did the smallpox eradication over a period of 6 years. So yeah, I have no doubt that the Indian state machinery will get all of us vaccinated against COVID-19 in 6 years. But is that something that we would like to countenance?
Okay, I think we are running out of time. We will get to questions soon, and we might spill over 5 or 10 minutes beyond the 5:30 deadline, if that's okay with you, Ajay.
It's perfect.
But before I get to that, I think one other quick case analysis of what went wrong with the farm bills a few months ago or last year. Most intellectuals and thinkers on this topic, including you and many others, including some in our audience today, like Mekhala, believe that in principle, most of the provisions of these bills are in the right direction. Nothing seriously is wrong with this. But then, so why the storm? What part of that pipeline didn't work? What went wrong?
I want to make my sentence a little stronger than that. I have read the bills and it's almost entirely on track. Okay, so I've read the details of these bills and I have no reservation in agreeing and supporting with what is being done, with some minor quibbles here and there. So these bills are clearly on the right track. In terms of policy pipeline, so I have two comments to make. One is on the policy pipeline and one is on a bigger problem. In terms of the policy pipeline, I think that there was a certain element of surprise that the long, slow policy pipeline tends to sensitize the public discourse. So going through the process of having public debate, of having innumerable seminars, of having government committees, of having a draft law that is on a website, of putting it through the standing committee process, of standing committee calling experts and refining the bills. This tends to improve the work and it tends to sensitize the public discourse as opposed to surprises. So it's a fundamental law of liberal democracy that you don't surprise people. Nothing should be done by surprise. Everything should be semaphored well ahead of time so people have a sense of what is coming, and there should be a public debate which generates feedback loops which come back into improving the work. So that's in the failure of the pipeline, that the public debate, the government committee, that kind of machinery, have a draft bill on a website for a long time and take many ideas and suggestions on how to improve the bill. The second thing I want to say is a little more complicated on the foundations of the economics. As I said, I have no reservation in saying that I agree with the bills, but I also see that The bills constitute a limited liberalization of a massively distorted agricultural sector. And there is no economic theory that teaches us that these partial liberalizations in the face of very large distortions are always welfare improving. Okay, so we know that the entire framework of agricultural policy is broken. And in that, when you make one change, it is conceivable that it can actually hurt. So a process of talking to people and negotiating with political groups is required in every democracy. Kelkar feels strongly that there was a social contract around wheat and rice and a whole array of agricultural distortions that was a response to the horrors of the 60s when we had those two consecutive droughts, and we were supported by PL 480 food aid from the United States. And Kelkar feels that we entered into a certain kind of social contract where farmers in Punjab and Haryana and some other places were essentially given a very peculiar combination of PDS and free electricity, high yielding varieties and so on. And it solved a food crisis for India. And he thinks that you need to build something bigger, some sort of IMF structural adjustment program to go after the problems of these regions in a deeper way. That if you try to narrowly only do this, it will become uncomfortable, it will become awkward. So I think we need to strategize more and engage in more politics around these questions. And I want to use the word politics because it links to the first poll that was done in this session. I think we in the Indian middle class have started demonizing politics and politicians. But in any country, what we need most is a good politics, is a politics of give and take, is a politics of respect, is a politics of negotiation, where various people see the world differently and they talk to each other and they negotiate, they find compromises. One of the most dangerous things in the modern world is the polarization, is the inability of different people to meet in rooms and negotiate solutions. And the negotiated middle road is always a better way for society to proceed. So I think there was a need of much more sensitization and political negotiations, finding common grounds. And if there is a class of people who are so unhappy about this bill, about these bills, then I as an economist will accept that maybe my understanding of this is incomplete. And it can be that a limited move in a horribly distorted system can actually be welfare negative. It is not at all proven that every limited liberalization is always for the better.
Perfect. I think there is, of course, much more to go into on the vaccine issue, on the Farms Bill issue, and on the theoretical framework. But maybe let's do that in response to a few questions. And there are many questions in the chat box. So we'll start off with Bijal helping us curate some questions. But meanwhile, Ajay, if you want to scroll through the chat box and see if any question sounds good to you, you could pick that up directly. But yes, Bijal.
Sure. Thank you, Ravi, and thank you, Professor Shah, for that very interesting and multidimensional conversation, talking of so many different aspects and so many important elements. Moving quickly to Q&A, apart from the ones that I mentioned here, I think I would first like to start with inviting Mikhala Krishnamurthy to please come on the microphone and ask her question or give her observations. Mikhala was also there as a speaker on our series a few weeks ago, and it was also very interesting conversation. Delighted to have you here again today. And Mikhala, please, if you could ask your question first.
Thanks so much, Bijal. Thank you so much, Ajay, for your talk. And so since the last question was about the farm laws, and I won't go into the deeper details. I mean, I think, and of course, I've also looked at the bills carefully, and I do think there are, or acts now, I do think there are actually fairly serious flaws in terms of the design, if you understand how primary agricultural markets work, while agreeing with you on the direction of some of these areas. But I think the point you made at the end, which was about limited liberalization in a complex space, possibly having a whole series of effects that we may not understand. I think that is something that is a really astute and important point, even for those who have taken a position prima facie that, look, we can see the direction and these are good steps. So I think that's one, very useful and generative place to come to as we look at some of these decisions and where we might go going forward. I wanted to seek your views on three particular points. One is about law and policy. One of the problems I've had, you can take it with the farm laws, but with other things as well, is the reduction of complex issues to legal problems, right? And what happens when you enshrine policy, things that should actually be policy or institutional or continuous decision-making processes into law, right? And there's obviously a relationship between failing in implementation, and that's why we turn to law so often in India and turn things into rights. But this challenge and your reflection on this relationship, right, of when, you suggested a whole series of diagnostics for when the state should intervene, but within that, the kind of intervention that is required, right? Is it a legal intervention and therefore leads to regulation, or is it something else? And there are other kinds of ways in which the state engages with sectors and with people and with institutions. So that's one question. The second is about the potential limitation of just looking at market failure if we don't engage enough with market structures and organizations, right? So does the state have a role in shaping the quality of the market and the shape of the market, not just letting it function? And I'm with you. I'm not coming in with this idea that the state is not violent or coercion is not a real problem, right? We accept that, and it is incredibly important to keep in mind always. But also to say that in contexts like India, where we have deep structural challenges, right? And if you look at the agricultural market as another example, of a market where actually public investment is often more important in strengthening the hands of producers who experience structural problems, right? So we sometimes use the word freedom in an economic sense in deeply constrained and structurally asymmetric contexts where we reproduce the structural inequality unless different institutions, and not just the state, play a role in actually changing the balance of power in those markets in ways that actually shape better collective public outcomes, right? And also, what would happen if you took the word positive externality? Is there a difference between positive externality and public value, right? Does the state have a role in, is there something different, both morally and actually in political economy sense, between public value and positive externality, right? What reshapes how we think about whether it's the social contract or the nature of the kind of society we are building if we make that kind of shift? So that's the second sort of quite tough but I would be very keen to hear whether there's a different role for public investment. I mean, agricultural transformation didn't happen through legal change. I would argue even the major strides that occurred in the liberalization period in Mark II were not because of just regulatory changes, but also in certain kinds of ecosystem support, institutions, and capacities that were built. And finally, I would actually be very interested in this context, particularly on economic policy, to hear your views on the informal, right? The actually existing Indian economy is overwhelmingly informal. And I think one of the big problems that we have is we cannot think of solutions beyond formalization. Of a certain kind of imagination of formalization. And there again, it's not just a regulatory problem. I think the state has a critical role to play. I think other institutions have a critical role to play, and we haven't quite got to that, right? And we think about the mainstream, and that's one of the big problems with the farm laws. Again, it has imagination of the private corporate sector and its imagination of what is actually an informal, highly intermediated, not terribly inefficient, but deeply intermediated economy. So I leave those, as just opening to kind of open the space a little bit. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Meghla. All four are deep, thoughtful, insightful, important ideas. let me go through each of them. So first on farm bills, I'm happy to discuss with you further. As I said, in essence, my thought is that the fact that so many people are unhappy surely proves that my economics theory is wrong. Okay, meaning the idea that this limited liberalization was going to create welfare, I treat it as proven that that was wrong. Okay, so I'm just simultaneously saying that I agree with that. I thought that was correct. And I'm saying that I was wrong. So I'm just putting both on the table, that if so many people disagree, then they are right and I'm wrong. Okay, and that's the space for politics. That's the role for politics. So I don't disagree with what you're saying, that, you know, overall we've got to be skeptical about the gains that are being obtained from these bills. Okay, while it fits with a certain theory of where we are going in the liberalization of agriculture, maybe the thing to do first is to fix electricity subsidies. Maybe the thing to do first is to fix fertilizer subsidies. I mean, you don't know which end of a horribly distorted system you want to start at. Maybe this was the wrong end to start at. And there, technical economics is not an important part of the game. There, it's politics that wins. What you want is a negotiation. What you want is high quality give and take in a room where there are fundamentally political figures. It is only politics that can feel its way through the problem. So I'm with you on that. Okay. Second, you talked about law. Okay, and I have a very an attempt at precision on thinking about this, which I think about in these two ways. Everything that the state does falls under exactly two bins. Either you're spending public money that was obtained through the violence of taxation, or you're coercing private people under the threat of violence. There's no third thing that a state does. Okay, and in the Constitution of India, in every liberal democracy, there needs to be a specific authorization for that violence in a law. So anytime any government is going to reduce the freedom of a private person, it needs backing in law. Okay, so that is the criticality of law. And then when the power to inflict violence upon private people is given to functionaries and politicians, it leads to very bad things very quickly. And so you need a whole machinery of checks and balances. And then that checks and balances is not about being nice guys. It's got to be embedded in the law. So the only checks and balances that work are those that are wired into the law. So once again, solving public choice problems, solving the bottleneck that officials and politicians are self-interested, is found by executing detailed checks and balances inside the law. So as an example, there is only one field in India where this entire journey has been fully completed, at least at an intellectual plane, and that is finance. That there was a more informal approach to financial reform in the early years. We kind of ran out of that steam by about 2005, 2006. The RBI Amendment Act of 2006 was a turning point in our thinking on this subject. And then came a research process and a thinking process that led up to FSLRC, which got done roughly 2011 to 2015, over a 4-year period. And FSLRC is that fully articulated vision of, here are the market failures, and you need state intervention to deal with those market failures. And here is the comprehensive checks and balances, which shapes and constrains the working of financial regulators so that it does not degenerate into horrible behavior by these persons. In countries elsewhere in the world, on the expenditure side also, you see tremendous checks and balances embedded in law. So for example, in India, there is a budget line for a department and a department can more or less do whatever. But in the United States, every detail of the spending program of a department is negotiated in the legislature. So the legislature is saying, no, you talk to me, you convince me about what you're going to do on spending it. A budget is not just a carte blanche for an official to spend as they like. Okay, so that is the role of law. Everything comes together, the rubber hits the road in the law. That all public policy ends up in the laws that authorize and shape coercion, and ideally more and more legal structure surrounding government expenditure programs. Otherwise, we're just giving arbitrary power to officials to spend as they like. So this would be my main response to you on law, that all of us need to focus heavily on these laws and worry about every little detail. What power is being given to who, to coerce in what fashion? How can there be corruption and incompetence? How do we create the checks and balances so that civil servants behave better? That is the main legal theory of policy reforms. The third thing you said was about what's a market shaping role that there can be for a state. It is a bit of a Nehruvian view of the world that the government will exert a leadership role and it will figure out what market structures should be, and there will be some benign good politicians and officials who will understand how to design markets better. And I must confess that I was part of the early years of the NSC project, and there was that kind of vision that some people in the world of public policy are going to dream and build financial market infrastructure which will be better than what private people would have done by themselves. Okay, so I'm freely confessing that that's the kind of childhood delusion that I used to have. And now that I'm older and I have white hair to prove it, I've shifted positions considerably. And I think that these things work much better if they evolve organically out of the people. There are two great advantages out of organic evolution of market practices. One is that you will have many rivals and they will compete. Whereas otherwise you get one single statist vision of some national market and then they will roll it out everywhere. Whereas private initiatives in their very nature tend to be manifold. And that is good because they will all compete and they will all discover the world. That none of us should be so proud as to think I figured it out. Okay, let many different initiatives take place, and in fact maybe the way in which you trade wheat needs to be different from the way in which you trade soya. Okay, your kind of work has always emphasized the particularity of each of these little worlds, and we should question the arrogance of an engineer who tries to say, here, I am a social planner, I have figured it out, and we will use state violence and state power to push this down. I think it works much better if these things evolve organically. And if you look at the successful stories of economic development in countries like Japan or the US or the UK and so on, markets have evolved organically. It has never been the case that there was a central planner that chose that this is the shape that these markets will take. There was many things that happened and it was primarily led by private people. And on the last thing that you said is the distinction between public value and externalities. I will unfortunately be all economist on you that, Jeff Bezos creates public value and Elon Musk creates public value. Okay, artists create public value. There's all kinds of public value. We should just be disciplined. Freedom is great and all of us create value by living and existing and creating in this world. But the case for state violence is narrow, it is market failure.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mekla, and thank you, Ajay. Bijal, we have anyone else who would want to come on screen and ask a question?
So we have our student, Veena Shirsat. She has messaged with a very interesting question. Veena, would you like to come on the mic, please, to ask your question?
Yes, ma'am. So good evening, sir. Thank you for that very interesting talk. So my question is a bit more basic than Professor Krishnamurthy's. I just finished my first year in economics major. So please consider my novice level while answering. So you said something on the vaccination strategy and on including the positive externality. I mean, of course, the externality needs to be considered on an individual level. But my question was that on a community level, what are the chances that a rich person will transfer the virus to a poor person? And like if communities of people interact more within the communities than with people from other communities in terms of caste or class or whatever other communities, in that sense, does the idea of considering a rich person who got vaccinated and thinking that, okay, it's better because I'm less likely to be infected, does it not make sense to have that thought only for people within your community or people who have been impacted in similar ways to you because of the pandemic than someone else?
So do rich people interact with other human beings? Yes.
In the sense of, I mean, of course, public spaces are there, But in terms of social,
or in offices, in homes, okay?
yeah,
Everybody interacts with other people. And by the way, please note, we are discussing numbers like rupees 2,000, rupees 4,000. Okay, so the level of rich is not something astronomical. The private sector cost of vaccination is between 2,000 and 4,000. That's all. So 70% of India is at a point where 1 year's income loss would be paid for when you compare with vaccination. So it's not like I'm talking something exotic.
okay. Okay. Yeah.
I'm just hammering away on one point, that instead of getting angry when rich people get vaccinated, we in the public discourse should be thinking, wow, great, you did the right thing. You put your own money, you got yourself protected, and you ruled out the ability of the virus to jump from you to other people around you, like me. Okay, so people are doing you a favor when they get vaccinated. So think exactly like a student attending Ahmedabad University is doing a favor to the 20 people in her world by building her intellectual capacity and her moral qualities.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Professor, for that very interesting response. I completely agree that when one gets vaccinated, one protects not only one's own self, but those around himself or herself as well, irrespective of whether it's a free form of vaccination or one that somebody pays for. What's important is that everyone gets vaccinated. Ravi, would you like to pick up someone for or a question now from here on?
Not yet. You have anyone who wants to come
Yes.
and ask questions? We can read out the other questions in a couple of minutes. But yeah.
Sure. So I would like to then invite Praveen, Mr. Praveen Tripathi, to please ask his question. He has agreed to come. Praveen, are you here?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Shah, for a very, very, illuminating, Saturday afternoon. My question was that, this is in the area of education. There are countries in the world like Germany where education is delivered entirely by the government, and very, very good quality education. And then there are countries like US where both private and government sectors deliver and share the burden of delivering education. The experience in India has been that, if you look at particularly, let's say, medical and engineering education, that almost always, and with some notable exceptions, Ahmedabad University being one of them, almost always the quality of education delivered by a private institution is inferior than that delivered by a government education institution. The worst government medical college delivers better, medical education than most of the, let's say, top private medical colleges, again, with a few exceptions. Now, if you're saying that the government, should really stop doing many of these things, so would you therefore suggest, I'm deliberately asking a provocative question, that government should close down the IITs, IIMs, AIIMS, NIT, and all the government medical colleges, and let this inferior private education flourish?
So you were treating it as a given that private education will always be inferior. I see this as work in progress. This is a field that is changing dramatically. In fact, in my opinion, only in the last 10 years are we first getting to a serious development of private universities in India. And let this process play out 10 years more, I think you're going to see some pretty large changes in this landscape. As a student of IIT Bombay, yes, I do advocate that the best possible outcome for IIT Bombay is for IIT Bombay to be completely removed from government involvement and control. Now, in every country in the world, including the United States, there is substantial government funding into higher education, but that is channeled through research. So either it is defense, space, nuclear that is funding research, or it is things like the National Science Foundation that are funding research. And that becomes a competitive meritocratic thing, that the good researchers and the good labs in various universities, they could be private or public, would compete and get grants, and that becomes a funding mechanism, but it's not an entitlement. It's not a block grant coming into the budget. It is for a private university to establish its capabilities and build a good lab, and then that lab would be able to raise money. Or it is for a strong researcher in a private university to be able to go to the philanthropic foundations and to be able to raise money and so on. So I think that that's a good approach. And I feel that organizations like IIT Bombay or IIM Ahmedabad are actually well served by exiting their present status as government organizations and becoming full philanthropic institutions in the private sector. Meaning, I'm not advocating that they should be for-profit organizations. So I will agree with you there that for-profit private universities have really not worked. So it makes sense for universities to be philanthropic organizations. But again, would I propose using state violence to prevent for-profit private universities? No. Students are not stupid. People think 20 times before signing on to pay good money for 4 years tuition into a university. So I don't see a role for state violence in interfering with private people building universities. So again, a bit like what I was saying about vaccination. Don't stop people from doing things. If a private person wants to build Ahmedabad University, great. If Harvard wants to run a campus in India, great. Now, what are you doing as government? Please consider, what is your cost per student going into a government organization? If you turn that same cost per student into a scholarship for that same student to attend Ahmedabad University, would you get more bang for the buck? I will contend that the expenses per student in some government organizations, government educational organizations today, which shall not be named, are at numbers like 50 lakh rupees per year per student. For that kind of money, you could send the kids to MIT. Okay, so it is important to zero base and debate these things, and we should all be non-ideological. I have no axe to grind. Just here to get things done. So your first sentence was pitch perfect. There are places like Germany where public education works great. I just want to applaud, saying, wow, it's great. I admire you people. There are places like the United States where private universities play a big role. I want to say, wow, I applaud. I love Stanford. I love MIT. I got my PhD at USC in Los Angeles and so on. Okay, and then we have to look at the Indian landscape, what works, what doesn't work. Let's solve problems, and we should make progress.
Thank you.
Ajay, we have overstepped our limit, but would you give us another 5 minutes? I think there are a couple of more interesting questions.
For me, I have no constraints. I'm holding up all of you on a weekend, so I'm very grateful to you for the time that you're giving me.
No, you're not holding up anyone. We are all here voluntarily to pick up your pearls of wisdom. This has been so good. I see a raised hand, Megha Desai. Would you want to come on camera and ask your question?
Namaste, sir. I'm Megha from SEVA, Self-Employed Women's Association. So, sir, as you said that farm laws, you see a positivity and the things which you see is there is no flaws. So coming from the organization which has larger women farmers who are from informal sectors and looking at the ratio of small and marginal farmers, family farmers in India, which are the areas which you see can help these informal family farmers and the women, small and marginal farmers? Thank you.
If you permit me, I want to take this as an excuse to riff on a different theme. The greatest curse in India is poverty. And our highest moral imperative is to become a prosperous country located in a liberal democracy. Okay, so look at what happened in South Korea, in Taiwan, in Israel, in Chile, in many other countries that got transformative change in these countries. And once we get that engine of high economic growth going, then a lot of the everyday misery that people like you have in a very noble and selfless way devoted yourself to trying to solve, many of these problems will go away on their own. So in a way, look back at the period from 1991 to 2011, 350 million people exited poverty. So in the pre-1991 world, there was a lot of very noble and selfless work on trying to do good things for those poor people. But I feel for us as a country, it was 100x better that we managed to get those 20 years of GDP growth and those 350 million people exited poverty. So in similar fashion, my dream for what all of us should be thinking of is, how do we do 40 years of high growth comparable to the 1991 to 2011 period? How do we become a great liberal democracy? How do we become a great market economy? This should be our main story.
Okay, maybe need to understand better sometime in detail.
Thank you. Next, I would like to invite Soumya Chaudhary. Soumya, are you here?
Yeah, I am. Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
So the question I had actually, I hope the 50 lakh figure was not for IIT Bombay, because I'm also alumnus and I think the number I had was 2 lakhs.
Smaller
but maybe for AIMS and so on.
The bang for the buck just doesn't work. It doesn't make sense. It's like, why are you there?
So, sir, the question I had was actually, very few people, especially if you look at IITs, right, actually stay back. And today, if you look at parents, and I have 2 kids, close to 20 years old, want to push their kids overseas because it's like, that's the sign of success, right? Your children are going abroad to study, etc., etc. Do you think that the brain drain, which has happened over the last 30 to 40 years, is actually one of the real reasons why there's been, really a fall in the quality of private enterprise? I mean, today, if you really look at post 2011, the startup movement is coming up. There is FDI in a big way for venture capital funds, and India is one of the biggest recipients of that. So do you think it's actually, again, like the point you made about private education, the time will come that this is also that the time will come that people choose to stay back in the country, you have good talent, and you will have startups which will actually take on the world? So is this a matter of timing where India will become great again?
Yeah. I'm quite philosophical about the so-called problem of brain drain, and let me explain. So I want to say this in 3 parts. The first part is at the level of moral philosophy, that we're a great country if we do good things for the aspirations of each individual. That's all. And if the individual thinks I'm better off living in Mauritius or in the UK, it is their birthright. So first, just a fundamental moral point that individuals have the God-given right to be what they want and become what they want and do what they want. And a great country is one where people have more choices to live the life of their dreams. And anything and everything that we think about the world of public policy should be about catering to freedom as the objective, should be about enlarging and expanding the zone of freedom and the choices available to individuals. So if people choose to leave India, it's correct. It's their birthright. Because I don't think narrowly about a boundary of a country. I think about the people. If the people are good, if the people are happy, that's great. Don't worry about a physical boundary. The boundary is just an illusion. My second thought is that actually having people of Indian origin all over the world occupying some of the most important positions and roles all over the world has worked very well for India. They have been a bridge for India. They've been a stepping stone for the world to connect into India. So they are a connecting tissue in the process of globalization. Okay, so one of the most important forces in the modern world is globalization. Okay, countries do well when they deeply connect into the world. That unquestioned deep engagement with the world is the pathway to prosperity and excellence. And it has been quite good for India. That we are this amazing country where Sundar Pichai leads Google, and similarly there are people from India all over the top levels of financial firms and technology firms and so on. It has worked very well for India. So I will not say that it has been a loss for India, even leaving aside the moral philosophy of building opportunities and empowering the Indian people, because finally life is about people and not about states and not about boundaries. Life is about people. My third point is that I'm old and I've actually seen these ebbs and flows. So there are some years where India seems to get its act together, and then people from all over the world of Indian origin and some expats choose to come and live in India, and vice versa. So depending on how you measure it, if private investment in India peaked in either 2007 or 2011, we are having difficult times in India, and then it's natural that there will be more opportunities abroad and people will choose to leave and so on. So by the way, I actually see lots of young people of today going abroad, getting a degree abroad, and coming back to India, because in many ways, particularly given the nationalism that is now being found in places like the United States for the first time, today it's much more unpleasant for young people from India to be placed in those kinds of settings. So, in a world where there is more nationalism, then it becomes more unpleasant to be in other countries. So these things will ebb and flow. That when India finds its feet and India becomes a vibrant, active environment where there is creativity and there is opportunity and there is dynamism of private investment, I have no doubt that lots of people will come back to India. So people living in India or living outside is an epiphenomenon. Borders don't matter that much in the modern world. The really, really important thing is, can we create conditions for human excellence, human creativity, human imagination, private people doing things, private people building organizations, private people investing. This is the concept of progress that we should focus on.
Thank you, Soumya, for that question. Thank you, Ajay. We'll close with one last question, I think, and then we will let you free, Ajay. Our colleague, Professor Pallavi Vyas, seems to have an interesting question. Pallavi, are you there?
Yes, I am there. So thank you, Dr. Shah. This was just fabulous. I just moved back from the States after being there for 20 years, 4 years ago. And I was there when, it was like refreshing to leave because there was, in the Trump regime and coming back home, and it felt good. But now it's beginning to feel, slightly oppressive after 4 years. So actually, this idea of the state control kind of, is percolated throughout Indian society. It feels like that dominance of the person who's dominating any structure that you're in. It weighs you down, and you really feel that difference between the US and India. So thank you for this talk. It's actually suffused me with some optimism and some hope for India, actually, to know that people like you are here. But the question I had was like, recourse to legal action that doesn't exist over here. Like, how does, we have these young activists who are now prisoners of war because they spoke up against an act. In the US, for instance, you have a prosecutor, you have the district attorney's office that, everybody can be represented. Like, where do we begin with that? I work in the area of economics and public policy. So hence I'm, thinking hard about what can we do, No,
I cannot agree with you more. I want to say it in two ways. The first is that in a conceptual way, the basic machinery of the Constitution of India has not worked out. And the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary as co-equal branches of government has not come out. There's tremendous power concentrated, and we don't have those checks and balances. I think Farid Zakaria has a great line in one of his books where he says that the courts are a more important site of democracy than elections. And, India is a great demo of that kind of problem playing out. So we really need to work hard on the courts. By the way, my colleagues and I are active in that field on figuring out what is going wrong with the Indian courts and the Indian judiciary and how these things can be done better. And I'm happy to talk with you further about that. So that is a huge issue. And this comes back to the foundations of what we're calling the Mark III, that we did some limited notions of economic freedom in Mark II. But today we are understanding that the excessive power of the Indian state, which really feeds into all aspects of life in India, is a really big problem. And that is the heart and soul of how we should be thinking about Mark III. We know from experience in India and all over the world that this kind of central planning system, this kind of state domination leads to stagnation. You don't build a vibrant society under an environment of state stagnation. And you would have heard me repeatedly mix up words around freedom and creativity and economic prosperity. And that's really how we should see this, that there is a creative act that bubbles out of the hearts of some human beings. Sometimes it could be creation in the world of art. Sometimes it could be creation in more intellectual and academic and research pursuits. Sometimes it could be creation in the world of business. All these go together. They are one. You cannot create walls between them and say, I want you to be a creative businessman, be obedient to the state, and then don't be creative in the other parts of your life. Human freedom, human imagination, human creativity, these are really the foundation of every successful and prosperous society in the whole world. And we in India are often too instrumental in thinking about prosperity, and it's fine, I want to get rich, but I don't want the rest of the package. And it's important for us to bring liberal democracy up front and center. That is why, while we are a hardcore economics co-authors, so Vijay Kelkar and I are economists, but if you see the title of our book, it is In Service of the Republic, the Art and Science of Economic Policy, because we see that at Mark III, where we are today in India, the heart and soul of getting the economic side back on track is building a republic, is building the republic. There's no distance between the two. You can't say that I want to do a China model, that I want, you to be rich people, but there will be no real freedom. The checks and balances, we are at the stage where the question of the republic and the question of the economy have fused, have become one and the same.
No, thank you for that. That's a great, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Pallavi. So hopefully that gives you some peace of mind, Pallavi. Thank you so much, Ajay. This has been great. We have kept you for a long time, but we'll let you go. We hope that your Mark III becomes a reality soon. You have friends in high places, so I'm sure they are listening to you. So sooner or later, we will get to Mark III, but in the more near future, hopefully they are listening to you on the vaccination rollout, and hopefully we will move up from that 70th position in the world in terms of vaccination. That needs to move faster, but Mark III will come hopefully at some point. So thank you so much, and have a good weekend. And I'll pass you back to Bijal to close the event for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Ravi. Indeed, what an exciting conversation. I think it could have gone on for much longer if only the clock could stop. From vaccination to reverse brain drain, to finance, to farm policies, from importance of discipline to freedom, to creativity, to economics, to intellect and democracy. Oh, what a conversation. Thank you so much. We all are going to mull over this over the weekend and think a lot more about it. Many of us from Ahmedabad University and from this audience will get in touch with you separately. Professor Shah, thank you so much for a wonderful weekend.
I'm happy to engage in all ways. Let's stay in touch.